Welcome to UberCube, the podcast where we discuss all things cube, but with refreshments. This is your host, Anthony Adams, aka UberBear, and today I'm joined by my other amazing host.
Hi, it's me, May, also known as Magic.
How's your day going, Magic?
I am doing pretty okay, a little sleepy, a little drained, but otherwise good.
Magic cracked me up. I thought I was the only one that I thought I held the exclusive rights to all dad jokes up in here. Would you mind tossing this little zinger you threw at me? You made me giggle.
Ugh. So today we have a special message from the UberCube staff to let you know that brushing your teeth is the only time that you wash your skeleton. Thank you.
It doesn't take much for me sometimes. I will be reserving that one for my family and my coworkers. We've got an interesting conversation that we're going to have today. It's a listener submitted idea. Chris Singer, who sent in an email to the UberCube Gmail account, which will be included in the show notes. And it went kind of as follows. I'm working on a cube and I want to know how to, expand or contract my cubes. What if, hypothetically, I had a 360 and I didn't have the play group for it and I wanted to downgrade, not downgrade, but tighten up to a 180 or vice versa? What if I wanted to go from, say, a 180 to a 360 or any other doubling number that you might choose to meet your play group requirements, right? And this is a real challenge. May, you were talking about, you've kind of experienced this challenge, haven't you?
So, yeah, I've had that problem before because most of my problem has been from downsizing, where I tend to have too many packages that I'm wanting to introduce or too big of a cube that I start off with, and then I need to cut it down because my playgroup is just not very big.
Yep, and I went the opposite direction, and we're going to talk about this extensively, but my Monopoly, I did a proof of concept at 216, and I expanded to 432, not realizing, frankly, how difficult that was. Like, it was very challenging to do that. So I thought we had an interesting concept here about the expansion and contraction of existing cubes and how myself and May might go about doing that. But we've also got, before we go any further, some really cool news that we wanted to share. Let's get the business in the front, right? UberCube is honored to actually collaborate with the Gathering Place LGS out of Chapel Hill, North Carolina, once again. We recently, back in July of last year, coordinated with them on the Extra Life convention, and it was fantastic. So we reached out to them. And what we're going to do is on April the 27th, we're going to host an UberCube event where we're going to have 64 players, 8 cubes, and then the top 8's going to play my powered vintage cube for all the glory, etc. There's going to be prizes, raffles, and they've got an on-site karaoke setup stage. It's really sweet, May. I know, May, you like you some karaoke, right?
I love me some karaoke.
Me too. I mean, I don't think people like listening to me karaoke, but, I will be on that particular evening. And they've got like a bar, etc. They got our local North Carolina beers, everything. I just love the vibe of this place. It is cool. But anyways, tickets are currently on sale right now. I've got the link that I'll include in the show notes. And man, we would love to get not only our listeners, but friends, etc., new cubers, everything. These 8 cubes, I'm going to be putting the list out soon. Most of them you've heard us either talk about on the show, etc., but we're going to try to give something for everyone. It's going to be really exciting. I'm looking forward to it. So the UberCube event, I will have in the show notes with a QR code and a link to actually purchase the tickets. And it's just going to be all around exciting. We are super hyped to be doing this. It's going to be me and Stu, and we're still working on May and a bunch of other people, but we've got a plan. It's in place, and it's coming together. So look for news on that and look for the link, and we would love for you to join us. Before we go any further down this rabbit hole, we're going to do the thing that we always do here at UberCube, and we're going to enjoy our libations of the show. May, what are you having on this delightful day?
So I'm actually being responsible this time, and I'm actually going for a really nice type of tea. It says it's a tea, but it's like a jam that you stick into hot water in order to mix it up. But it's ginger, citron, and honey. And I shake it up with some hot water, and it's just really soothing on the throat. Highly recommend it.
You have to tell me where you purchase these things from. You always got the amazing
Costco.
Teas. Costco. We got a membership to BJ's, and got myself a standard Guinness here. And let's go ahead and crack it open. All right, we've got our user submitted hey, UberCube, I want to either increase or decrease the size of my cube. How do you go about doing that, right? Well, I, at the time of this question, had no idea, but I was already pondering it ever so slightly because I had, and we talked about in a previous episode, built the Monopoly, which is an economic-based cube that I've designed where basically all the cards reflect, I guess, the turbulence of economic society, the cultural divides we see. I'm trying to do this poetic capture of what I see in the world from everything from globalism to capitalism. And it goes well beyond the borders of just the game of Monopoly. I'm trying to project a thematic vision of how I see the world. And I wrote it with the wealthy get wealthier and the poorer get poorer. And I'm just trying to make how do people overcome that struggle, etc. It's my artistic way of weighing in using cube as a medium. May, you're familiar with using cube as a medium to kind of, I guess, translate an idea, right?
Yeah, I mean, cube is a way that we can incorporate art into a sort of game design lens, and I think that is a cool way that you can share that kind of perspective with other people, and curating that experience for people when they draft is neat.
Yeah, so what was interesting is I had already built this cube. It was kind of testing the waters. It was my first foray into the idea of a desert cube. And I guess even though I'm going to say that I did the expansion part and I was deliberating on whether or not I had done the contraction part, I in fact did to build the 216 version. Because the way I went about doing this, our good friend ChillMTG, great YouTube channel, highly recommend you check it out, has the Dragons of Winter's Night. And I got to play this at CubeCon, and I absolutely fell in love with this. It was my first foray into a desert cube, right? And our friend Bones has one too. I've just never actually jumped into or delved into the world of desert cube design. And for those that aren't overly familiar with that, basically your lands are embedded in the draft, right? You're typically going to take 5 to 6 lands per pack, in this case 3 packs of 18 distributed amongst 8 players, and you have to draft your lands. That's kind of the gist. And when I looked at his list and it was at 432, I had to walk it backwards to get my scales, right? Because I wasn't wanting to build a cube at the time, unknowing whether or not my group or my circle would actually want to play a desert cube. And I figured, hey, this is a neat concept. How can I make this I guess, interesting, but not overly committed to the cost and things that would be involved with building a brand new cube? Because, listeners know this. I have we won't say the word addiction, but I certainly have an addiction to cube design. It's like my passion. I do it all the time. And building a new cube I wanted something I could pack up and go fast. So I built this as a 216 version, reverse engineering the land quantities and the creature quantities and the spell quantities that Chill had at 432. How could I take it back and do the ratios and scaling that I knew was successful in the Dragons of Winter's Night? So I guess in that proof of concept of scaling, while I didn't build the cube from the ground up that way, I walked his backwards in order to build my first iteration of the Monopoly. May, do you have any thoughts on that?
Well, I obviously don't have a lot of experience drafting or interacting with your cube since you're the creator, but I do have my own experiences when it comes to specifically detracting and bringing down cubes from larger sizes, because the problem is that there's a lot of cards that I want to play with, and there's a lot of packages that I want to introduce, and it's often difficult. Before my Fae Cube really kind of took off as much as it did in terms of popularity, that I was trying to work on an alternate version that had a much more limited selection, because the reality is that I have a much smaller playgroup, and having to adjust kind of what that identity is while maintaining my artistic vision is difficult. And it was a project that I ended up having to sideboard because it was just not something that was feasible for my environment. But in this case of Big Spender, where it started off as this pile of penny cubes, I ended up working that restriction of, hey, I need to bring this down and bring this up into a reasonable amount, and instead being hey, instead of trying to adjust how many cards I'm trying to put in to make this environment work, instead I could just rework how the environment works to make it more enjoyable.
Yeah, there's a lot of different styles, and we're going to kind of go over. We'll start out with how I guess I started out with the reverse engineering part, and that's how I developed the initial 216 iteration of the Monopoly. And once I built that, and we played it on multiple times, played it with my friend groups, and they enjoyed it. Then I took it to CubeCon at its 216 version, and specifically Chill played it and said, "This is great. I'm enjoying this." I don't know. Something about that was my seal of approval, right? That I got somebody that has developed a very strong Desert Cube, said, "I enjoyed this very much." I got thinking, well, it's not everything that I want out of the cube. Like, I was just testing the waters on whether or not I could develop something like this, because it's definitely outside of my cube curation comfort zone, right? When I was talking to our good friend Chris, he even said, "I just want to be honest with you. Like, desert cubes are not my thing. He still got the positive attitude as a drafter. I'm going to do it. I just can't believe you built this," right? And so that was kind of like a challenge accepted, because it's definitely a unique way of designing a cube. And this isn't about the desert idea. This was just about making a cube that was emulating like a smaller 180 style, in this case 216, and then testing it, falling in love with it, and then going, "Hey, I can do more with this. Like, I can take this hard idea, and I think I can expand this." And this is where the challenge really comes online. I frankly, I've completed it since, but I'm going to tell you that I bit off more than I can chew. As if it wasn't hard enough for me to distill this down to functional archetypes at 216, or in your case with the Big Spender Cube, I still can't wrap my head around how you took 81 cards and made a story, right? Like, that's hard.
Oh, it's tricky. And so, the way that Big Spender ended up working out for that kind of accidental downsizing is the best way that I could put it, or failure to upsize. It ended up leading into a more fun thing, because the thing that we always tend to say is just the classic game design philosophy of follow the fun. And when you have a selection of, level up cards, it's just like, okay, how can I curate an environment where these work, but also have enough cards that are around the same power level as these things? Because they're a nightmare to try to curate around. So the first approach that you can do in terms of trying to adjust how many cards that you're trying to make, if you can't really upsize, is that you can just adjust the way that you're actually drafting and playing the cube, and working your way around what you have, rather than trying to upsize or downsize. And that is an option. Obviously, that's not the perfect answer that you're going to be looking for, but I thought that it was important to mention.
Yeah, and I think it's important too. We like to go 40,000 feet in the air. I spend a lot of my life in airplanes. I'm coming up on 1,000,000 miler soon, believe it or not, May. So I think about 40,000 feet more than I should. But the benefit, there's a pro and con to everything we're going to talk about. And May and I were pre-gaming about this conversation a little bit. The gist is that tighter cube lists have the positive aspect of the synergies and the archetypes that you're trying to convey will be easier to hear. They'll be cleaner. They'll come within the sight of your drafters, and they'll be able to construct much tighter, less than retail limited type decks, borderline constructed decks. A good example of this is and a lot of people talk about this, using Storm as, I guess, an assembly line story here. Storm functions so much better whenever your list is tighter, right? Like at 360 Storm decks, you can get these components and you can build it together. Even though the components within Storm are greatly contested in those type of environments, like the mocks and all that, even so, the pieces are there, and people get more defined lines of play within a tighter package. Even tighter, for example, at 180. If you go down to 180, the lines get even tighter, right? And there's nothing wrong with that. The con of that May and I were talking about with the smaller cubes is you can lack replayability sometimes. And I know that's not always true, but I guess the diversity of decks may not always be prevalent. Unless you've got, let's just say, a meta or people that are willing to try new things, there's a good chance that your Boros player is always going to try to grab Boros. I mean, it could happen. Would you agree with that, May? At a smaller cube size?
Yeah, so one of the things that can happen when you're trying to downsize your environment is that it makes the environment a lot more consistent. And when you have a play group that is very spiky, for example, and they're just trying to look for the best way that they can solve their environment, and they're looking to test their skills, then it can really work well. That's why I feel like a lot of vintage cube designs, when they're scaled down, actually tends to favor a lot of those flavors of players, because it actually can encourage a lot more skill-based environment assessment in a way that is consistent and predictable. So it makes every booster pack feel like that, all right, there is a specific route that I'm trying to go for, but there is also a non-zero chance somebody else is trying to go for it. So there's signals and all of the things, and there is an innate skill level that it encourages. And that can be a great thing for a lot of people when you're scaling down. However, the downside is that when you're just kind of playing casually and you're just trying to appease that kind of sit down, play Magic type scratch, then it can cause problems of kind of repetitiveness, because you're going to be seeing the same cards every time, same decks are going to be popping up, and how well those decks perform is going to be almost innately based off of the player's skill level rather than the deck complexity that comes out of it, if that makes sense.
It does. I would say that like generically powerful cards at a lower cube size may not look so homogenous because they just play well independently. I think it becomes more homogenized when you're trying to support a theme, right? Like the Aristocrats deck or the Merfolk or Goblins or whatever. They're always going to kind of like, I'm not saying they're always, obviously there's the variance of a draft, right? But you're still going to see a large percentage. The probability will align that a lot of the decks will assemble in such a way and look similar-ish at a smaller cube size, which is perfectly fine, and you will get strong play patterns, but it does govern. There's a degree of replayability and variance that sometimes adding a larger cube size can happen. Now let's go to the other end of the spectrum. It's kind of the Goldilocks concept, right? It's too hot, too cold, just right, right? And we're not going to be the gatekeepers of what's just right. I'm just going with personal experience. I would say when you get in these larger cubes, you start adding in, I don't want to call it draft chaff, but you start adding in cards. Let's say you go up to the 720s, 630s, and there's a lot of people, even 1080s, and that's amazing, and I love that people do that. But you definitely start adding in cards. If you're following a singleton notion, if you're breaking singleton, then this is probably a lot easier to break away from. But let's say we go into a big expansion. Let's do like 720 or something. And you're going to start putting in cards that are definitely not as good as, I guess your highs and your lows, your peaks are going to be a lot different on card power, et cetera, right? Unless you get functional reprints, you do run that risk. Would you agree with that, May?
Oh, absolutely. Like, you can see this a ton in the vintage environments, because things like Lightning Strike and Lightning Bolt existing in the same environment just because, hey, we need extra copies. And that problem only gets amplified the more that you're trying to expand upon that package, because you're now having to settle for 4th, 5th best, 6th best in order to fill those slots. So you actually have to consider that when you're looking into your packages, how large that archetype can actually get and how much that you can actually support it. If you are trying to create an environment that is trying to support some niche archetype and you're not wanting to break singleton, so let's say energy counters from Kaladesh and Aether Reborn, or Aether Revolt, right? Where we have those energy counters, which effectively have never been seen again outside of that block. But if you wanted to make an entire environment out of those without doing doubles, it's not going to work for a larger cube. And that's kind of the general issue when it comes to expanding some of your things. So sometimes you have to ask yourself, how much room do I have to wiggle within that archetype? And how much can I expand that individual package?
And on the positive aspect of larger size cubes, you get diversity, right? You get more replayability. The decks might not be as lean and mean, but there's opportunity for the aha moments that we've kind of talked about on the show. May's coined that phrase, and it comes with great value because we're going to talk about some of that happened in the Monopoly, right? Incidental stuff that when I expanded that I was not looking for, that unlocked itself, right? When I started using Scryfall and I'm like trying to make these formations of archetypes, I suddenly started realizing I had incidental synergies upon the expansion that wasn't necessarily in my original plan. It just kind of unlocked itself. And then players saw it, but I had some aha moments while doing an expansion. Because sometimes we get streamlined, right? We talk about the paper, rock, scissors, which we've talked about before, or maybe I want to have aristocrats, or I want to have burn or big green, and we kind of try to define these as notions or whatever so we can have labels to communicate amongst ourselves in the cube community. But there are these incidental synergies that's hard to put a name on, right? Like typal synergies that you weren't expecting to unlock, but they fell into place. Like, for example, when I was building my artifact cube, I was building around, artifacts, and I said, maybe golems will be in here, but I wasn't really reading the word golem, etc. But I never realized how many artificers were just happening all of a sudden, right? And I never looked at the word artificer as a synergy piece where I could add components. And later down the road, I'm staring at it, and I did a query, and I'm like, oh my gosh, there's like a metric ton of artificers in here. Why don't I have artificer payoffs? I'm so focused on what the artificer does, makes a thopter or something like that. Why am I not capitalizing on what the type of the card is so I can get even more out of it? Or constructs, where I'm reading this card that says, go get a construct, cool. But then I'm not reading that it actually, there's a lot of constructs it can seek out. That's just a good example. These, I guess, as you expand a cube, you may think you need to make these like really ridgeline archetype borders as you expand, but sometimes I guess the synergies will find themselves. Have you experienced that, May?
Yeah, sometimes that can end up leading to branching archetypes that ended up happening. I've talked at length about like how wolves packages have adapted and evolved inside the Fae cube as an example, but a recent development in that environment was the fact that I had to take a lot of the base wolves out of that cube just because I needed to flesh out more of the elves in that environment. So if I were to ever expand the Fae cube, that would be the first place that I'd look is, hey, I want to reintroduce all these wolves packages rather than the elf wolf thing that I was currently doing. Organic.
Let's use the Fae cube as an example. I have a question for you. It's at 360 right now, and let's say your play group expanded and you wanted to go to 450. I can tell you how I would approach this. If you wanted to expand that cube, like what steps would you take as a curator to go from 360 to 450 in this example?
So I will note that it is particularly difficult just because of the avenue that I chose to support being through party, through changelings, through very typal focused things, adventure cards that, even though we've gotten new adventure cards, for the most part, they're very, relatively speaking, small in quantity compared to a lot of other mechanics and archetypes. Like if I were to say, if I had aristocrats in here, then that would be something that I could expand into because it already overlaps with token themes. Or like I mentioned with the wolves package. Or I'm trying to look at what packages I currently have and what packages that also can work into the themes that currently exist. But the problem is that the more that I would expand into those, the less consistent some of those typal and whatnot themes would become, because they're just not as supported as I need them to be.
So I would use, before we even go into actually talking about the expansion I experienced something similar. Like for the longest time I pondered on, could I make the horror cube larger than 360? And I want to say, kind of reiterate what you said. If I try to go larger, it felt like my archetypes were falling apart. Like the messages that I had, the subtext within there suddenly started collapsing on itself. It's really hard, and my buddy Chris and I talk about this all the time. Cutting cards is not easy. Adding and cutting cards is simply not easy. There's a lot of methodologies to do that, and we can talk about that on another episode. But sometimes you get these cards that are your pet cards, or they have an important function, and you've got a new card, and you feel like you can replace it. It's very challenging. 360 is a tight list typically, right? After years and years and years of curation, some of these lists get so I refer to them as stable, that it's hard to change them. So I felt like, hey, I've got a good thing going here. Why am I so eager to go, say, from 360 to 450? Because I had some more cards I wanted added, but it would get more, it would get loosey-goosey on the archetype development. And that is a consequence of that expansion, right? No more. We've got a listener of ours right now on the Discord that's looked at my horror cube, and forgive me, I don't recall the individual's name, but they were recently taking my horror cube and they took it down to 180 because their play group can't support 360, or felt like this individual wanted tighter patterns. And it was interesting to see what they did. They just kind of looked at some of the ideas. They didn't necessarily clone it, but they've been shaving out cards and cutting it. And I joked about it on the Discord. I don't know if you saw this, May, but the individual's like, how do I approach this? I'm like, well, you can look at my list, clone it, and then become Edward Scissorhands. Just start cutting all the chaff that you don't like. And I know that's hard, but it's just slicing and dicing until you get what you think is a functional cube. And they're like, aha, okay, cool, I can do that. And that was the best way I could approach or answer that. So let's talk about the Monopoly for a minute. So I went up in this case, and went up from the 216, which is the smaller cube that was developed for 2 to 4 players. And it was great, and I felt like the confidence that I had from it is I did a proof of concept. It was something I was a little unsure of, as I mentioned before, and I felt like it's working, but it wasn't where I want it to be. I want to double it. I did a few things here that were outside of my comfort zone. One is I broke Singleton, right? I've never broken Singleton before. I like synergy. I'm ex-military. It's just, it's hard for me as an individual to do things that aren't symmetrical, right? And I said, you know what? I'm going to do it. I'm going to throw the towel in. I'm going for it. And I did it. And I'm happy with where it's at now. And a lot of people have helped me by giving me feedback. May and Chill and my good friend Chris and others have given me feedback on what works, what doesn't work. And it's starting to evolve into a cube now. I'm happy now. I'm at 432, and I've got my proof of concept. I got a recent play in there. But how did I get there? How did I go from 216 to 432? The first thing that I would recommend any curator going up or down. I like Cube Cobra. It doesn't have to be your tool of choice, but I enjoy it. If it's an Excel spreadsheet, rock on with your bad self. Always copy the original, create a backup, right? Just like with any computer file or Word document or email, always back it up just in case you lose all that hard work you put into it. So I sandboxed the concept by cloning my existing cube. So I took the Monopoly 216 and I went ahead and I renamed it, and I called it the Monopoly 216, I guess, sandbox mode. And I saved it and I cloned it. And then I renamed another file, literally an identical clone that took all the work that I put into the TLDR and everything and the exact cards into a sandbox mode. And I made it where it was private so the world can't see it, right? I wanted to be able to start adulterating kind of a copy, if you will, right? Without actually breaking my original one, because I was uncertain, May, if I was going to do the expansion. Is that how you would go about it?
Oh, no, outright. I have a hidden micro Fae cube that I was working on that ended up getting shelved. Like, it's very, very important that when you are considering these changes and when you're trying to experiment within those margins, that you have an additional copy of it. Do not ruin your initial cube for a hypothetical. Yeah, because I have started building cubes and then backed out halfway because it didn't feel right. I mean, I've got the Bolt the Bird cube that's been sitting there forever that I started tinkering with, and I kind of dried up. I'm going to eventually talk about it in an episode. And I've got a chess cube that I started developing, but I didn't like the lines of play as it was developing. I couldn't get enough out of it, right? And in this case, I was curious. I'll step back to another example. Before I did the Monopoly cube, I had considered taking the Munson cube, the Lords of Metal, which is about Joven and the 10th Street tour. And I spent all this time, and I talked about it on an episode with our good friend Stephen Conefall. Check out that episode. And I was thinking to myself, I'm like, I can probably just take this cube and expand it easier than the Monopoly, right? Like, which one am I going to do? And the Monopoly, it was not comfortable for me. I already told you this was a hard cube. And the Munson's like a Jun cube, right? But it has an identity. We talked about it with metal and all that. And I was like, well, I could take this up to 360. First thought that I had as I started entering cards is I'm like, it's going to lose its identity. Like the cards that I've chosen are in there because it's like a ticket. It's a concert tour. It's meant to be fast and tight patterns. And it's meant to be 2 to 4 players. It's not meant to be 8 players. That was never what I wanted it to be. But somewhere in the middle of that fog of war, I started developing this idea. And also I realized it would just become any old Jun cube as I started adding cards, because I started losing cards or started adding cards that didn't fulfill the thematic or identity requirements that I expected of, something where I'm playing Metallica or Sepultura in the background, right? I was just adding a green card and saying this is an elf and it's metal, but it started feeling weak. Does that make sense, May? Right. And the issue with expanding thematic ideas is that eventually you're just going to run out of space within that idea. So, sometimes it's fine. Just break singleton. It's fine. Nobody's going to be upset because you broke singleton. I even broke singleton within the Fae cube, and that's a 360 cube. Like, that is a relatively average amount of cards. It's okay.
I'll add one other little pin here that's interesting. Your theme can still shine through even if all your cards aren't on theme. I was making the show notes and I was thinking about this, May. Sometimes we as curators can follow a theme like the captain going down with the ship sometimes at a cost, right? Like we're putting a card in there because it's so thematic. It's so, oh man, this is just flavor for days. It might be a bad unplayable card and we're just forcing it, right? Because it's like, they're all going to get this. They're going to understand it. I'm going to die on this hill. But the card might not actually be good for the environment, and it's okay to put in, I don't want to use the word filler, but some staples, some cards, and you can even find art if you search hard enough, and like using the Fem cube as an example, that cube is hard too because I have to wait until they print a blood artist that has a woman on it, right? And that creates like an interesting curation challenge for me. I won't just add any old thing. We talked about this before. My buddy Jason's like, why don't you just get like a proxy? I'm like, absolutely not. It goes against what I'm trying to do from the artistic standpoint of this cube's development. I want it to be printed by Wizards of the Coast, like an official card or Secret Lair or whatever, right? That fits the mold, the expectation of the thing, but I'm not willing to sacrifice like what this cube is about just to, put a woman on a card that's never been printed as such, right? That would be cheating in my mind. So that's a thought when you're expanding and contracting, and you hit the nail on the head, May, when you're talking about thematic cubes. I think that's something that people think about a lot, right?
So on the opposite end of the spectrum, good stuff's cubes tend to expand extremely well because the pool of good stuff's cards is ever growing. Wizards is not going to stop printing good cards. They want you to buy booster packs. That is an ever-growing list. So when you have some kind of variant of a good stuff cube or this kind of synergy cube, sometimes it's just so much easier to grab those new packages that come in, and expanding your cubes can just be as easy as, hey, this new set came out. I really like this set of cards or this package from this set. I'm just going to throw it right in. And sometimes that's just genuinely easier than what we as curators tend to struggle with when it comes to more tight-knit or under-supported archetypes and themes.
So let's talk about like some of the things I unlocked as I was expanding the Monopoly in the expansion portion of this, right? And they're odd. I didn't expect this to occur. In the 216 iteration, it was fun. We had a good time with it. It played tight and it did what I wanted it to do and everybody had fun. But I did notice like these emergence of haymakers that were really hard to beat in so many words, like Titan of Industry, which represents my thematic hotel. We've talked about this. Check out the Monopoly episode if you haven't heard it yet. But it was a card that like once it landed, if you were limited in what you had to deal with it because it was only at 216, right? If you didn't draft it, dies to removal is a fair argument, but there was a point where like people are like, I didn't see anything in this pool to even fight or combat this. So this was one of the cards, one of the prevailing wins that actually led me to, hey, I can take this. I like Titan Industry is going to remain still there. I love the card. I love what it stands for, right? It ends games. But at 216, it was ending games pretty rapidly because a meta started developing pretty quickly, and they knew if they got in the green and they got certain, I guess, powerful, beefy, trample green cards, and that wasn't always the case. It just didn't make people want to do all the things I wanted to do. So the proof of concept was there, but the expansion allowed me to test the thresholds a little bit more. So what did 432 provide me, right? So I was looking at my cube. I'm trying to look at it from all these different directions. It's 216. I've sandboxed it. I've cloned it. I've uploaded it secretly to CubeCobra where nobody can see it. And then I started doing kind of the breakdowns. And this is something May's taught me, where I'm doing the tables and I'm wanting to see, like, what is my average mana value? What's my curves look like at 216? What's my removal suite look like? What are my creature threats? I'm counting them out. Like, what are the cards that are in the 216 patterns coming up so often that people are like, this is fun, but it's beating the mess out of me and I can't deal with this, right? And I don't want to make all these silver bullets for these cards. I just want to figure out, like, what can I unlock? The other thing I did is I started searching and I started really looking at the creature types. Originally, we talked about this like with the artificer. When I'm looking at them and it says, when such and such artificer enters the battlefield, make a thopter. And it's easy to get like the rose-tinted glasses, May, and go, hey, made a thopter, and I'm going to support thopters or whatever. Forgetting that artificer is like a subtext, right? Something you can look at. In this case, when I ran my queries and I did the search function, I noticed I had a pattern of rogues coming up. May, you like rogues, don't you?
Yeah, you could say that I like rogues. That they're totally not a part of the Fae Cube. Totally not.
So how did rogues fit into my thematic build? I mean, for me, a rogue is like the rebellion, the undercity, right? Because I'm developing this economic cube. I want thieves. I want people that are doing like black market trading underground, right? I want this subtext of, I've told you, you've got this elitist society and that's going to be represented by stuff like I talked about with Titan of Industry, right? Where for me, that's the juggernaut. That's Wall Street. I'm getting really philosophical or geopolitical there, but that's kind of where I'm envisioning it, right? Mm. But for every society, you're going to have your upper class, your middle class, your lower class, right? And I'm trying to build like this whole systematic type of layout for this cube without like subtext is there, but it's still supposed to be fun, right? But thieves serve a purpose in society, right? I mean, they're not always, sometimes they're the Robin Hoods and sometimes they're your criminals, right? I mean, this is where rogues really, do you see where I'm doing with this, May? Where I'm kind of pulling this in?
Sure. I think sometimes that it's important not to get caught up into the trees rather than the forest, and just understanding that your forest has a lot of rogues. It has a lot of people that are disguised as trees, and it's okay to kind of be like, hey, I have a lot of rogues. I could just throw in a little bit of rogue support.
Yeah, that's what I didn't even notice. Like, when I started looking, in my original iteration, I think I had like 16, 17 of them, and I'm like, and that was accidental, like, because the cards fit like my little subtext of the name in it says like rob or steal or tax or whatever. And I'm like, whatever. And some examples of that, just for the namesakes, would be stuff like Nephalia Smuggler or Daring Thief or Undercover Operative or Morbid Opportunist. And these are all rogues, right? Not even realizing they were just like the things that were kind of playing into my economic ideas. And I started counting after running those queries that, again, May had encouraged me to do, looking at the cube from all these different angles. And I'm like, man, I got a lot of rogues. I'm just going to start typing in rogues, and I'm going to go to Scryfall and see what kind of rogue payoffs I can get out of this. And I came across this card. Anawan the Rune Thief for 2 colorless and Demir, you get a legendary creature vampire rogue for 2/4. Other rogues you control get +1/+1. Whenever one or more rogues you control deal combat damage to a player, that player mills a card for each 1 damage dealt to them. If a player mills at least 1 creature card this way, you draw a card. I'm not a mill proponent. We've talked about this, May, right?
Yeah, you tend to have very hostile opinions towards mill.
Then something about this card made me just fall in love with it. Like, it gave my rogues +1/+1, my incidental rogues that I wasn't trying in my expansion. Let me ask you a question. To the best of my knowledge, so I don't really support the reason why I chose this card. I was thinking about something that you had done, and it was your land dump, your red land dump. What is that? Countryside Crusher? Can you tell us about that?
Land dump red. So land dump red was, and this is something that we can talk about in a later episode when we actually go back to the Fae Cube. But Countryside Crusher isn't going anywhere. It's like a big part of the Fae Cube. It's a big part of what it does. And the reality is that Land Dump Red was an archetype that I tried supporting for a long time, where it was a matter of what are the best ways that I could just dump a bunch of lands in the graveyard and then get the most amount of payoffs for dumping those lands into the graveyard in red. And it was interesting. And, like, don't get me wrong, there are still key parts that still exist for that archetype, but I don't have to spend a lot of pieces to make it exist. When people want to bring this into fruition, they're just going to do it. All they need is just the birds, the Molten Vortex, I think it's called, and then Countryside Crusher. Things like that. And that's enough for you to be like, hey, I'm going to fill my graveyard with a bunch of lands. And sometimes just having small, neat packages that are strong enough as individual cards that if you have an increased, say, tutor package or a good consistency package that's available, and I will also add that into, if you're looking for ways to expand, improve your consistency of the cube. But that's besides the point.
So my question for you is, this is the only card that does mill in my entire cube. But now, because I latched onto this, and because of the anthem it provides to rogues, I now have 31 cards that interact with the word rogue, meeting my seedy underworld requirement, the thing that I wanted to do with the Monopoly cube, right? And I'm looking at this as a functional utility card. There's a lot of reasons for this. I don't have a great deal of graveyard interaction, so once it's gone, it's gone. That's part of my design philosophy for this cube. Is you don't get to do reanimator in this cube, and there's no hand stripping, and there's no land destruction. I've got a lot of weird rules, but we'll go over that in another episode. But once Anawan or another rogue, when Anawan is present, connects, you've just dumped a card in your graveyard, right? You've lost your nest egg is now going away. There's some more economic philosophies that I have tethered into this, but I wanted this to be like permanent, right? Like the stock market is crashing, Anawan and the rogues are attacking you. You don't get insurance and recover. That's a topic for another time. But when I'm looking at this, that's what I'm looking at. My question for you, May, is I took on the challenge of a single card pushing a synergy that does do +1/+1. We'll talk about another 2 cards here in a moment. But in this case, I don't think this is a linchpin, but it's not signaling mill, but it does incidental mill with definitely a very prevalent, if you do the rogue synergies and latch onto it, it's a payoff is what I'll refer to this, not as a... Do you think this is a false signal?
No, absolutely not. You have the density. It is the right amount of cards and for your environment for this to exist. So... for you to say, for your worries that it's somehow a false signal because a lot of your rogues are just generically good, I just don't think that that's an issue in the same way that we wouldn't say, Champion of the Parish? The 1-drop human that whenever another human enters, put a +1/+1?
That's so perfect you said that, actually. I'm kind of going off the script here a little bit, but I did this similar kind of notion with, I've had Blood Artist in here from the beginning, but there's no air quotes aristocrats package, but I added Zulaport Cutthroat as well because there is sacrifice in here because, going back to my philosophies of economics and all the things I've studied in college and all that, is that there's a certain about a grind to this game, and I wanted these things to be like incidental payoffs, opposed to like there's not a full package, but if you grab these cards and you connect the dots, right, there's synergies that can be unlocked. And I think I got my inspiration from what you did with Countryside Crusher, which I thought was fascinating. Because I would have argued until I was blue in the face up until this point that you had to have X amount of percentage of a thing, else you were in the previous days, right? If you'd asked me a year ago if I could have one card that when my rogues connect and it just so happens to mill you down, not mill you out, because that's not the intention of the card. It may happen, but it's a payoff, I think. And I'm hoping the listeners, I'd kind of would like to get some listener feedback on that and what they think about that. I run 2 aristocrats and I run Anawan. When you're drafting this cube, that's an expectation, but it's a weird one because as you're looking for other cards, you're like, yeah, I'm going to do mill, and you're not going to find it. What you need to be looking at, I guess, as a drafter, is do you feel like that's getting advanced? I'm hoping they see the word rogue, other rogues you control get +1/+1.
Like with the Countryside Crusher analogy and where you pulled inspiration from it, it actually sums up exactly the thing that I was saying with Champion of the Parish, is that when you have enough good cards that just supplementary add to that thing that you're already doing, adding a payoff on top of that, being like, hey, you are already drafting this thing, here's kind of a payoff for your thing. It feels a lot better, I
would agree with that. So in the expansion portion of this cube, pushing from the 216 to the 432, this is a way that you, the listener, as a curator, can try to find components to payoffs. Can be a great way to do that. You don't have to worry about like, well, I'm going from 180 and I've got 4 aristocrats, so I'm going to 360. Now I must have 8 aristocrats. I'm going to tell you that you don't have to do that. It's very environmentally dependent, right? If that's what you want. But cards, depending on the cube speed and the environmental context, can be simply payoffs. And I think what you said with the Champion of the Parish. Champion of the Parish is a fine example of that. I run that in my horror cube. I don't really think about it. It's just in there because May's mentioned this before. Humans are all over the place. I'm looking at a couple of them right now on the list, just in the Monopoly cube. The next card that I added for expansion because, hey, I'm like, oh man, rogues are an option, right? Thieves' Fortune for 2 colorless and 1 blue. You get a typal instant rogue. It's got Prowl, 1 blue. And I'm like, what is Prowl? I had no idea. You may play this card for Prowl cost if you dealt damage to a player this turn with a rogue. So it can reduce the cost. Look at the top 4 cards of your library. Put one of them into your hand and the rest in the bottom of your library in any order. So it gives you card selection with a typal payoff, which I think is fantastic. So, and it's just a value card anyways, which neat about Thieves' Fortune, and it says the word thieves, so it fit my thematic requirement. But then it also gave you this incidental, well, I've got a lot of rogues. Matter of fact, Stu drafted this deck and he said I think he 3-0'd with the rogues. We were on the way to the first game at the new expansion, and he's like, can you tell him anything? I'm like, heck yeah, man, do the rogues. And he's like, that was, and he loved it because it was a different way of looking at deck construction. It wasn't so, I don't want to say the word generic, but typically when we build a deck, we either do like guilds or we do like archetype driven type of design. Getting into these synergies, I think, is like really cool. May, your Fae Cube has truly inspired me with like unlocking synergies like next level, right?
It's because the Fae Cube kind of looks at a bunch of different angles, and that's something that you can consider, you as being the listener, you can consider when you're looking at your own list and trying to expand or detract, is what kind of angles can I expand or detract from? Is, oh, am I trying to support a typal thing that just doesn't exist? Or, hey, I may have accidentally supported a typal thing. Or another great example of accidentally making a good ramp package into a color that's not green. Things like that is cool incidental things that you can actually expand into that you can really follow the fun with.
Yeah, and you don't have to always tell your drafters about it. Sometimes it's kind of fun to watch their faces whenever they unlock it, right? It's exciting. They're like, well, I've got 9 rogues. Oh, man, there's Anawan. Like, you'll see somebody just kind of, you'll see somebody literally light up in the draft. They're like, and then the next card that I added to kind of top off this rogues, there's a lot more rogues. I'll name some in a minute, but this one here was a big deal. It was a random payoff, was Robber of the Rich. Again, following my theme. Gonna do it anyways, didn't have to try hard, but for 1 colorless and 1 red, you get a creature, human, archer, rogue, who's upside down, not sure why. Reach, haste, also don't know why, 2/2, I guess it's an archer. Whenever Robber of the Rich attacks, if defending player has more cards in hand than you do, exile the top card of their library. During any turn you attacked with a rogue, you may cast that card, and you may spend mana as though were any color to cast that card. This card was already in there because it was Robber of the Rich. And then I'm like, well, Anawan kind of likes that. They're gonna mill. I can stack it. I can also look at the top card, and I can choose to do this one first, and I can exile it. You see what I'm doing here, right? These 2 cards, if you did a Grixis package, that's pretty nuts. Incidental payoffs. Pretty cool stuff. You have any thoughts on that, May?
I mean, trying to find the best way to formulate it.
Trying to figure out why
there's not a lot for me to contribute in terms of the individual card because, yeah, cool. It's a cool card.
Cool card. Cool card, bro.
It's a cool card. It's just reiterating our point that this is a card that already existed. It already had accidental rogue synergies, so you throwing in more things that are in that line does not feel out of place.
So another part of an expansion concept, this is going outside of my comfort zone too. I'm going to take a cube and I'm going to make it bigger. And we talked about me reverse engineering originally to make the 2.16 version using ChillMTG's version of Dragons of Winter's Night. And then I got there, I was happy with it, proof of concept, loved it. And then I built it very guild-based, right? Like, I'm so linear sometimes in my thought processes. I'm growing as a human, but like, I always think like you got to have, 4 blue and four red, and if I'm going to do 3 guild slots, you see where I'm doing this, right? Like everything has to be like symmetry. I do that. And I got to thinking like, this is a treasure-based cube. I use that anyways to kind of, that was my little comfort I guess my life preserver for doing a desert cube is I wanted to have treasures in there because I wasn't sure if my math was going to work on my scaling up and down as I did this engineering. I basically did a lot of math to try to build this thing the first time, right? Now I'm expanding it and I didn't want to lose all that. But having all the treasures, I said, you know what? Why am I struggling to just do guilds? Why am I doing 2-color varieties in certain subsets? I'm like, New Capenna and these other sets have a lot of things that follow my themes. I'm going to put in multicolor aspects. And I think that, like 3-color cards, and sometimes 4, and a lot of hybrid mana cards, they've really grown on me. After playing like the Live the Dream Cube by David McDarby and these other people that have expanded these ideas, you're seeing these show up a lot more, like in even the Moto, right? Cards that would have been like a faux pas 10 years ago, like you can't cast these, has too many pips, but the card is so powerful. If it costs you 3 mana, why not add it? So I actually said, you know what? I've got a bunch of spots here. I've got about 15 cards that I could probably put in just to support, like, what if you used a treasure and that was your splash to get like a rug or a bug type color set or so Naya or whatever, right? Why am I confining myself strictly to you've chosen like Anawan and you're going to be Dimir? I could let you go even further. The payoffs are already there with treasures, and my mana already allows for it because you're forced to splash sometimes in my desert cube. So I got to see through my proof of concept, May, that the opportunity was there just to go into 3 colors and 4-color cards and get some more variety in the deck building, more payoffs, build-arounds. Do you like build-arounds, May?
I do like build-arounds, but they have the problem that the more that you expand, that, like we mentioned before, the more you expand, the harder it becomes to support versus, hey, my density's already there, I'm going to have the payoff for it, you know? But one thing that I do want to talk about, and to kind of move us along, is I think we should talk about the Ginny Fae incident, because I think that it exemplifies sometimes being a little too ambitious. Sometimes it's fun to add to your new package, add your fun new toys, and try to be like, oh, I want to add this new thing. It's going to add a new shift to the meta. It's going to shake things up. And then you're like, oh, I pushed the gas a little too hard. Oops.
Yeah, this was a payoff, and I thought it'd be fun. So one of my goals for this cube, and Chill knows this because he's played it before, and I got to get May to play this, is I like to take the treasures. I don't want to punish treasures. I've learned this from the Artifact Cube. Like, I've learned the hard way on sometimes it's not right to build a cube and then punish people for playing your cube by adding cards. Like, Collector Oath will forever be a stain, a mark upon me. I need to get it tattooed on me. But I wanted to make cards that would not only use the treasures to advance your board state so that you'd use them to play the game, but also one of the ones that, like, if you chose not to crack the treasure, you could win the game type of stuff. And there's a lot of cards in here that if you build up your nest egg, you can win the game. Well, Ginny Fae, Jetmir's second, and this is where it's going to get weird. It's going to be for red-green hybrid, green-white hybrid, so easy to play, by the way, with treasures. This is where the mistakes happen. For a 3/3 legendary creature, elf druid, just this absolutely a gorgeous socialite, fits what I'm trying to do, right? With a cat and a dog just prancing along. If you would create one or more tokens, i.e. treasures, you may instead create that many 2/2 green cat creature tokens with haste, or that many 3/3/1 green dog creature tokens with vigilance. Seemed defensible to me. I've got Gala Greeters in this cube. And
I am literally shaking
David,
my head at you.
Yes, you see where it's going with this. And I have 2
yes.
Gala
In the
Greeters.
environment where I make treasures, I'm going to have a 3-drop that makes 3/1 vigilance or 2/2 hastes.
2 Gala Greeters, because it says Greeters, and something about my design aspect says you can't have one Greeter when it says Greeters. You got to have 2 of them. And so I put 2 of them in there. My buddy David drafted both of these and then had Ginny Fae and a bunch of other like treasure generation cards. It was insanity. So my buddy Chris, he's moaning and groaning over to the left of me. He's making a defensive stance. He's like, I can't beat this card with my Izzet deck. I'm like, just burn it, man. It's a 3/3, and I don't even have that much burn in this. I don't know what I'm talking about. I'm like, I've got all the removal. He's like, I got no removal. I'm like, whatever. You didn't draft the removal. I'm doing the dies to removal argument, right? I'm defending my stance. Like, it's my new outing for my cube. I'm dressed up like Ginny Fae to the ball here. I've got my cat and my dog, and you can't tell me otherwise. I'm defending it. He ends up winning, but he wins just begrudgingly, right? Like, he's fighting Ginny Fae nonstop. So then I rotate around. I take my match and I move over and I'm playing against David because we're just rotating around. And I start playing against Jenny Fae. And I'm the person that has all the removal. I'm an Orzhov. I've got every piece of removal you can imagine. But based on the kind of the Regency bias or the conversation that was happening from Chris, I found myself holding up, knowing this was an interesting conversation we had amongst ourselves. Yes, I can remove Jenny Fae. I have murdered and I have everything like murder. I can kill this card. But once this card stuck and David had enough treasures, it was going to be very hard. It was like a mental chess match that was happening. Like I knew the existence of this card. I had bias coming in my mind. And the question that we had, the sidebar conversation we had amongst our friends, and David presented it so well, is if I had to play an entire game, even though I had the dies to removal argument, where all I had to do was think about, I have to deal with this Jenny Fae no matter what, and I did like 3 times, I had to reserve all of my removal and let other things go through because Jenny Fae would be so game warping. He basically made the argument, do you want games to feel like that? You understand what I mean by that, May?
Yeah, of course. I'm going to follow this up. A very targeted question. Do you regret trying Jenny Fae?
I do not. This was my first time ever playing with Jenny Fae. I had seen this in EDH decks before and never paid much attention to it, to be honest with you. It was a good friend, Christian, we talked about him in previous episodes, loves to play new decks, and this is one of his favorites. And I thought it was a neat deck. I didn't mind playing against it, but I only played it against it in a multiplayer environment, so it was a lot more manageable. 1v1, it was pretty rough. I do not regret it. I wanted to try it, but I will accept that the hybrid mana cost embedded in it, the availability of treasures, it wasn't that it beat me. It never actually beat me. It just, I guess the word is it mentally beat me. It made me warp my entire play around this card. And I don't think that's healthy.
So I had a similar thing happen to me with the Wolves package forever ago, where I had Hollowhenge Overlord in my Fae Cube for a bit. And that was an extremely game warping card of, sure, it comes in at flash speed. Sure, your opponent could remove it before you get Wolves. Hypothetically, that is a line of play that could happen. But that was never my line of thought. My line of thought is, you're paying 6 mana to flash in a Wolf, right? If you're playing up to 6 mana, you should be getting in a game-winning position anyways. But what ended up happening is that I put it in, and then it ended up warping the environment because I was trying to expand that package. But I don't regret trying it. I don't regret trying to push that envelope because we as curators need to be willing to experiment, expand, and etc. And yes, we can understand when things are a mistake, but learning and expanding and improving our cubes is part of that process. And my point of bringing it up and reiterating your Jenny Fae aspect was that when you're expanding, don't be afraid to push the envelope just because you're afraid that something might end up being warping. If it is, then you can change it around.
I would agree with that, and I think this is a good time to move over our final thoughts, actually, because that kind of summarizes what I want to do. Would I say that expansions and contractions run risk of destabilizing your cube? I'd say yes. I think based on what May just said, is it worth the risk? I would also say yes. I would say that the way that I would approach this is to clone the cube, modify the cube in the clone version, always back up and store your existing cube, right? You don't want to mess with your horror cube or your Fae cube that's currently stable, but you want to tinker, you want to play around, you want to test concepts, and then ask your play group to take a look at your list in the digital format or your Excel format or whatever medium you're using, pen and paper. We've had friends that do that. And to take a look and say, hey, does this make sense? Do you see any trip lines here, right? Because Jenny Fae, I got a little rose tinted with that. I was so, frankly, hung up on treasures are a payoff in this cube. I want to weaponize them, and I want to expand this cube, and I want to do something I've never done before and jump into the, not guilds, but the tricolors and so on and so forth. I want to have more things to do things, more toys, right? Testing things that I've never done before. And did it warp the game? It did. My friends were really cool about it. I got enough feedback. And at first, this goes back to our feedback we talked about at first. I was taking this defensive posture as Chris is sitting to my left, and he is a damn good Magic player, right? And when he's telling me, I don't think I can beat this card, and I'm like, whatever, you can't beat this card, I can beat this card. That dies to removal argument was me turtling up a little bit, right? I was taking this defensive stance. And we talked about this before, the processing the feedback. This was an emotional feedback that he had given to me, but I wasn't seeing the forest for the trees in so many words. Jenny Fae was actually represented more than a bomb. It was scarier, frankly, in that environment than Titan of Industry. The reason why I even expanded this cube to begin with, May, I've now added another component, not paying attention to it, but that's okay.
Mm.
You have any thoughts on that?
Yeah, and sometimes it's just fine to add additional components and experiment with what your initial idea was. I don't want to get too far on a tangent, but like I had Storytime Brawl Cube, and I still have it. It's just sitting in my quiver and over in the other room, but I rarely get to play it. One of the big things with it, though, is that people don't want to play it because it had dungeons and dungeon mechanics, etc. So when it came to, all right, I need to cut an entire package, I need to cut a bunch of cards, that was the first things to go because that was the first thing people complained about. And sometimes it's okay to just kind of be like, is something that I'm adding actually improving our gameplay experience, or is it detracting from when I'm trying to take it away? So to kind of wrap up some of my thoughts on it is that when it comes to expanding or detracting from your cube, make sure that you're emphasizing the playability and the actual play experience that you're trying to curate for your players over what you're trying to create the theme as the best way that I could put it. The cute gimmick of whatever your cube's trying to do, you shouldn't sacrifice the playability of the cube just to add a bunch of garbage cards that nobody's going to touch just because you want to expand the cube. Just make sure that you're staying in line with what your cube's goals are, and then work your way either up with just good playable cards that expand on the themes that you currently have, or work your way back by taking away things that people aren't excited for, that it detract from the play experience, etc.
Well said, and I couldn't agree more. Thank you, May. I appreciate that. I hope this has been helpful to the listeners, and I hope that we did this, Chris, I hope we did justice with this question that you asked, the expansion and contraction of cubes. This is how May, myself, and others approach it. So if anybody has any more questions about this, feel free to reach out to us. We'll have all these things that you can join our Discord, etc., which I'll talk about here shortly. But before I do, I want to reiterate, UberCube event. We're going to do this one more time. It's going to happen over the next few months, so bear with me. But it's a plug, right? We're super excited. I've been trying to put this together. I want to basically emulate the idea that our good friend Dan Loop has done with the Ice Cube, right? May, you attended that. It was amazing, wasn't it?
I did. It was a lot of fun. I got completely thrashed during it, but it was fun.
Yeah, that's what I heard too. I'm deliberating on whether or not I want to participate in this. So I was having a conversation with my friends about that today. Right now, I think we're going to just be the curators for now. We'll see how it goes. But there's an UberCube event on April the 27th at the Gathering Place in Chapel Hill, North Carolina. Absolutely. I mean, this is a sick LGS. It's like an old school building. They got a bar. They got karaoke. It's just a cool place. So anybody that's willing to come out and travel or whatever, we would be so happy to game with you. It would be absolutely amazing. We're going to have 64 players. That's the plan. And we're going to have 8 cubes. And I'm going to try to do this on my fingers the best I can. This list is evolving and changing. We're still working on May. So we'll say for now, the Artifact Cube, a Peasant Cube, a Horror Cube, a Pauper Cube, a Legendary Cube. We're going to mess this up. We got a Legacy Cube. We got the Fem Cube, and my Power Cube will be the top 8, and I 100% missed one. We will fill, the Light, I guess it's Light Legacy Cube. I don't know. Totally missed one. Doesn't matter. We'll actually have an official list coming up. That's still forming, but it's going to be a blast, actually. What I know right now is that the tickets are on sale. They are $55 for an all-day event. Starts at 9 a.m. on the 27th, and will go till really late, actually, with a karaoke after party. I know they're planning on like 9:30 to kind of wrap up and then move over to the karaoke type stuff, and it's got a bar. This place is sick. I mean, I love this place. I'm excited about it. I'm going to try to get May to come out. We're working on that. We're negotiating as we speak. There's going to be prizes. really good prizes. We work with these guys at the Extra Life convention, and yeah, I'm still solidifying that, but I know they take care of people, like really take care of people, and they're going to do raffles. It's going to be a blast. It's going to be nonstop, and there's going to be side events. So if you get knocked out's a bad word. Let's just say you don't progress in the tournament. We want you to continue playing for fun. There'll be incentives to do that as well. And then there'll be side event cubes that'll just be go over there and play that. You can knock out my 2-headed giant cube, etc. We're going to have, amongst Team UberCube, I know we've got like 23 cubes, so we've got you covered. It'll be a blast. So if you're a cube lover, first-time cuber, never tried it before, I will patiently help anybody with everything. One of the caveats that I do know is they're talking about doing randomization on the cubes. I know that may be outside of comfort zone for some people. I'm down to clown. We're going to talk about that. That's in negotiations, but I think it'll be really fun. Other than that, we're going to go ahead and say thank you to our Patreons. Keaton Schultz, Lord Justice, Chris Singer, Nicholas Lapointe, Stephen Conefall, Preston, and Sam McKenna. And if you love the show, we would truly appreciate a 5-star review on your favorite player. That really goes a long way to getting people to listen. We've been seeing Spotify reviews that are excellent. We've got iTunes, excellent reviews. Thank you for everybody that's doing that. And then Google reviews. It just really gets the podcast out there. It's growing. We are just so blessed to be a part of this community. It's expanding well beyond the dreams that I had, May had, and Stu had. So thank you so much to the listeners. We're also an affiliate with Alter Sleeves, which if you want to blink out your cube, this is the way to go. You can get 5% off of your purchase if you go to www.altersleeves.com/UberCube. You can see the sleeves that I have chosen for my cubes. I'm going to be adding some more, but like it is a conversation starter to say the least. If you want to support the show also, you can use our Inked Gaming affiliate link, which you can get your dice bags, your playmats, etc. It'll be included in the show notes. You can find all this in whenever you go to our Buzzsprout or your favorite player, you will see this drop down and you can click on it and go there and it will link you over. But yeah, the Ink Gaming is awesome. I can share that with you. And you can find us at Twitter at UberCube, or excuse me, at X or Twitter. I don't know what you call it anymore. What do you call it, May?
Zitter. Pixar.
Doomsday at UberCubeMTGPod. You can also reach us at UberCubeMTGPodcast at gmail.com. You can link us on Discord. We have an actual link for that. It'll also be included on the player notes. You can click on that and join our Discord. It is getting big, and Stu's not here today. He's got some business going on. But the Deck Boast channel that he has set up, it is frequented often. It's so fun to see, like, after pre-release events and stuff like that, seeing people populate, like, I totally crushed with this Demir deck. And I guess Murders of Karlov Manor. Had to think about that. Is it Markov? Karlov? Don't know. But we're going to go Karlov. And it's just really neat to see people do that. And we have a Patreon, as we mentioned. So thank you to our Patreons. You can find us at patreon.com/UberCube. And we would love, love, love to see you at the UberCube event on April the 27th. That would just make my heartstrings pull. Like, we're just doing all this to totally benefit the LGS and prize support, by the way. If anybody's asking that question, they were shocked. They're like, what do you charge them? I'm like, nothing. I just want a cube. Buy me a beer. And they're like, okay. So that's what we're here for, right, May? Just buy me a beer.
Absolutely. We're here to cube.
We're here to cube. I don't care about anything else. Other than that, we're going to say the thing that we always say here at UberCube is...
Happy cutting!
Happy cubing, cutting and expanding.